Welcome to this Halloween launch of Ghostlight by Kenneth Oppel. Oppel, it's Oppel, isn't it? Yeah, it's Oppel. As chair of the Silop Youth Libraries group, it's a real joy for me to introduce this event on behalf of YLG and Guppy Books. So a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please can I ask that you mute your microphones? You can use the chat box, say hello and tell us where you're watching from as well. You're welcome to keep your camera on. It's really nice to see everyone, but just to make you aware that we are recording tonight's session. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end. So if you have any, please type them into the chat box and I'll keep an eye on them and be able to ask them at the end. And finally, if you wish to buy a copy of Ghostlight, which I'm sure you will after hearing this event, Liz is going to put a link to bookshop.org in the chat and you can use the link. But now let's get to the main event. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's host, Alison Brumwell. Alison is librarian at Kirklees College. She's past chair of the Youth Libraries Group and was chair of judges for the Carnegie and Kate Greenaway medals in 2019. She's also a huge fan of Kenneth's, which I'm sure will make this evening's conversation an absolute delight. I hope you enjoy. Please welcome Alison and Kenneth.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be part of this event, and thank you Bella and Liz as well, and Jake too, for making it possible and alleviating some of my anxiety about the technical side of things as well. Before I get into the questions, I would just like to give Kenneth a brief intro. A few years ago, there was a brilliant book review written in The Guardian. And the opening sentence read, "The best children's books can be the strangest." The author of that book review was Marcus Sedgwick. Everyone knows I'm also a big fan of his. The book he was reviewing was The Nest, and that, of course, was written by Kenneth Oppel. Now, since then, he's gone on to write numerous other books. He had a very prolific writing career. Prior to The Nest, he has won and been nominated and shortlisted for many, many, many awards. The list is absolutely astonishing. You can go online and trawl through, his many commendations. And in 2020, he was longlisted for this brilliant book. I absolutely love this. If you haven't read it, buy a copy of this in addition to Ghostlight. This is Inkling, with a gorgeous cover by Kate Greenaway medal winning illustrator Sydney Smith. So Kenneth has also been the IBI nominated author for the Hans Christian Andersen Award in 2018. And in the nomination statement, Robert Bittner had this to say about his work. Oppel's ability to write from a child's perspective and expand the imagination of young readers is admirable. His innovative concepts and deep understanding of young minds and hearts allow him to turn unlikely subjects into international bestsellers. His work greatly affects young readers and gives them the tools to better understand the world they live in. And most recently, about Ghostlight, which we are celebrating this evening, an absolutely amazing immersive book. I love this quote. The New York Times, you can't beat this really. With a high stakes premise and moments as chilling as midnight ocean spray, Oppel plays his readers' nerves like an out of tune harp. And I think that really sums up the breadth of Kenneth's writing and his just amazing career over the past, I don't know how many years. I do know how many years, but I'm not going to. A very long time anyway. So welcome, Kenneth, and thank you for joining us all the way from Vancouver. We thought you were in Toronto, but in fact you're not. But it's such a pleasure to welcome you to the UK, even if it's virtually.
Thank you so much for arranging this and having me. I'm really excited to introduce the book and talk about it with you.
Well, I'd just like to start off with a general question. Obviously, you were sent these in advance. Your fiction can't really be easily categorized, as you've written across all genres for children and for young people as well, for older readers. What inspired you to write this extremely dark ghost story with its secret order of lighthouse keepers? And then just as a sidebar to that, who are your own writing heroes?
Well, Ghostlight began like all my books, really. I'm not that aware of genre when I write and brainstorm. I've been told I write in an awful lot of different genres, sometimes with a touch of disapproval that I'm so difficult to categorize. But I just go wherever I think the story is most appealing to me. And my stories usually start in a notebook, and I write myself a kind of a wish list. And in the case of Ghostlight, I've been gathering the ingredients for a number of years. And I guess the first thing was I really wanted to set a story on the Toronto Islands, which is a place I've come to love. And not many people think of Toronto as a big city on the water, but it is on Lake Ontario. It has a harbor, and the harbor is sheltered by this little archipelago of islands. There's about 13 of them, all connected with bridges and separated by little canals. And it's this magical place. It's this 10-minute ferry ride from downtown. So you go from skyscrapers to really this sort of faraway castaway beach town. People still live there. There's an amusement park. It's sort of like going back to your childhood in a wonderful way. And I've just been thinking for a long time, what kind of story could I set on this island? And it comes with a lighthouse. It comes with a 200-year-old lighthouse. Beautiful, tall, old lighthouse. I think it's the oldest and tallest in the Great Lakes, all the Great Lakes. And I love lighthouses, and that became one of my wish list items. And then just a ghost story. I like the idea of ghost tours. I like going on ghost walks. And I got curious about the people who give them. And whether they were believers in ghosts or completely indifferent. And I liked the idea of a tour guide who didn't believe in ghosts, didn't even particularly like his job. My hero, Gabe, would rather be working rides at the amusement center with his friend, Yuri, but it's decided that he is the right person to give the haunted tour of the islands. So I had, all these ingredients, and they just sort of coalesced around the lighthouse. And it helped that the lighthouse did come with a ready-made ghost story from the first keeper in sort of 1809. J.P. Radmuller disappeared one night and his body was never found. He was thought to have been murdered by some soldiers from Fort York to whom he sold bootleg beer. And the usual, sightings accrued over the years of a forlorn, limbless man looking for his body. They found a bit of a skull buried around the base of the lighthouse. And this is an excellent story, ghost story. But I just got rid of it because I'd come up with, my own story that I wanted to, insert into the lighthouse. So for me, those were my starting points. And I went from there.
And in terms of personal influences on you, we chatted a little bit about this before we started recording. Mm-hmm. If you'd just like to tell us a little bit about those.
Oh gosh, I mean, they're so various over so many years. I think probably, during my childhood, Roald Dahl was huge, mm-hmm. From the age of, 6 or 7 to 12. And then there's a Canadian writer called Brian Doyle, who writes in a very sort of oral storytelling tradition. I absolutely loved his work when I was a young adult and at university. People like M.T. Anderson, writing currently in the States, who wrote Feed, which is, I think, probably one of the most brilliant YA novels ever written. Philip Pullman's Northern Lights. And then, my influences explode outwards, or at least, those people I admire in the adult realm, starting from Mary Shelley and going through the Brontes and George Eliot. So, the cauldron is large for influences over fairly long life, a long career so far.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Ghostlight is set in the present day, and you've just explained a little bit about the geographical setting and that whole idea of the islands and the magic of the islands. But it also refers to the history of Toronto, or York, as it was at the time in the 18th and 19th centuries, like prior to Confederation. So how much research was involved in the writing of your novel? You obviously, have a real affinity with the locale. And you've mentioned your love of lighthouses, but there's an awful lot of history and a fair bit of science involved as well in terms of how a lighthouse works. And how did you weave those elements into the narrative? Because if you did do a lot of research, it's not obtrusive.
Oh, I'm glad of that. I mean, it's a tricky thing. I mean, when one does research, I mean, it's exciting. I learn all sorts of new things. And the temptation initially is to cram it all in there. You want to share all this wonderful stuff, and it can overwhelm, your scenes and your story if you don't wield it wisely. But I look at research as a gift in general, because I learned so many things that I wouldn't have thought of or imagined while writing the story. I mean, I like to think I have a good imagination, but the fact is the real things that happen in our world, that people have done, that exist in our world, are often way more wondrous than what I could cook up in my own brain. So you try and use them judiciously and weave them in sort of as needed into the narrative. My readers don't need to know or care, frankly, about, the exact mechanism of how the beacon would have turned in the 19th century. Yeah. So I find one well-chosen detail, like the smell of the whale oil, that used to be in the lamp. Yeah. That's enough, and that sort of conjures up a sensory, sort of image and a time period. In terms of the places in Toronto, I'd like to do research, because I get a lot of ideas from it. And really the book, when I was writing the book, I imagined it like it's a treasure hunt. It's they're trying to find this very rare and powerful lens called a ghostlight, which can vanquish powerful ghosts. And, their informants are ghosts. And luckily they have a ghost on their team. So they sort of, hopscotch between some of the oldest establishments in the city, from the oldest graveyards to the oldest homes, underneath the lake, in tunnels that carried filtration water from the islands. And I guess I was, as usual, trying to relive my favorite stories, which often involved a group of kids on an adventure, blissfully separated from any adult authority figures. So absolutely, everything was sort of on their own. But yeah, to me, I never wanted the history to overwhelm the story. So I hope it didn't.
Well, no, it didn't at all. And for me, it really made me reflect, having lived in Toronto, it made me reflect upon how little I know about the history of Toronto, because I grew up in Montreal. So the Canadian history I was taught was very particular to Lower Canada and what was going on in Quebec at the time. And I was aware of certain elements, but I couldn't believe how little I knew about Toronto, even though I lived there for a number of years. So it was really eye-opening for me. And when I do go back, I'll be going back with Ghostlight, and I'll definitely be going to the islands. So
I'm glad.
It was a real revelation for me. I think it made me see somewhere I'd lived for a long time in a very different light.
One of the other reasons I wrote it is I have been trying to write more about where I live, because we mentioned this really before we began, that growing up, stories always happened elsewhere. And I felt like my childhood was really storied by American stories and British stories, and they were excellent stories. It's just none of them seemed to happen, in the province or the city or the town I lived in. Yeah. And there's so many opportunities, I think, to tell, stories set here and mythologize our stories a little bit, which I think is healthy in a reasonable measure for for sort of a cultural, I don't know, sort of well of associations. So I've been trying to, explore my own terrain a little more in my books.
Well, thank you for doing that, because it's, it was such an enjoyable and powerful reading experience for me. You also refer in Ghostlight to attitudes towards Indigenous people. Many of the ghosts we encounter have been displaced or mistreated. And I absolutely loved the relationship between George Brown and Joseph Halfday. I thought that was just so beautifully done. Did you feel inhibited or challenged by touching on these issues, though? Because there's been a lot in the news, quite exhaustive reports of various different historic abuses. So I wondered how you felt about touching on those issues. And also, I know you had an authenticity reader. How important was that to your writing process?
Well, vital for me and extremely helpful. But approaching it, I felt, I did feel trepidation, because, it's a subject that here in Canada is very, alive and, a huge conversation, a cultural conversation for us. And, once I knew I was writing a ghost story, it seemed absurd and offensive, to not include Indigenous ghosts. It literally would have been a whitewashing of history if, there were just sort of white European dudes, popping up all over the place. At the same time, if you're writing about, an Indigenous community, you want to make sure that you're not misrepresenting their spiritual views. I mean, the idea of a ghost is, in my experience, quite a Eurocentric notion. And I had to do research to make sure that, ghosts had the same kind of, meaning or sort of, spiritual weight or value to Indigenous communities. So I did my research. I wanted to have them because, the parts of Toronto I'm writing about, had been used and for hunting and fishing and convalescence for millennia, long before, the French first came to my part of the world, and the English, and then, successive waves of settlers. And it made the story richer, because it captured the full depth, of human history, our collective history in this one little parcel of land. It's very deep. So I'm glad I did that work. And authenticity readers are becoming much more common. And I was very happy, to get a read from someone from the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, which are the Indigenous community I'm talking about in Toronto in the sort of 19th century. And I got the thumbs up. So it's a huge, you feel like, you did your research, you were as honest as you could be, you didn't misrepresent a culture. And I think like most things that are sort of honest and truthful, it made the story richer.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And it's, again, it did make me reflect on my own growing up, because we lived on the South Shore of Montreal, quite close to a reservation. And I have very vivid memories of being taken there on a school trip and being horrified because it was a bit like walking around a zoo and watching them do traditional crafts. And, there was a barrier there that I just was very unsettling. And I think you're absolutely right. You couldn't write a ghost story about this part of Canada without incorporating those stories into your narrative. And it's beautifully done. And I really hope, readers and reviewers appreciate that. So thank you for that as well. It's very thought-provoking, and there's a lot of really tender, empathetic writing when you deal with these characters, even though they are ghosts, and much of the action takes place in the present day. So I think it's just brilliant. Themes of grief and letting go and reconciliation, they also run throughout the novel. Gabe is struggling to deal with the recent loss of his father, and the ghost of Rebecca Strand is going through a very similar experience because of her murder and her father's as well. I do think the way you explore these, they add so much depth to the novel. But just generally speaking, can you elaborate on this and why you often explore family relationships where the parents, very often the fathers, are either absent or distant? You've also touched on you've developed some very complex sibling relationships as well in your fiction. And I'm thinking I have to show everybody this. I love this particular novel, Half Brother. But in Inkling as well, the father in Inkling has his own quite serious issues, and he's very removed from everything his son's going through.
I feel like I spent the early part of my my writing career getting rid of parents. I just didn't want them in my stories. They were vexing, and they sort of took away agency. And it's certainly, I grew up reading those books, especially in the English tradition of, Enid Blyton and Arthur Ransom, where there were no parents in sight. Those kids were sailing boats out into the ocean and disappearing into the countryside without any sort of authority figures, which I think was probably more accurate for that era of child rearing. But nonetheless, I increasingly have tried to bring more siblings and more parents into my books. It frightened me because it meant more work, frankly. It meant developing more complex characters and more relationships. But like most things that demand effort, it was immensely rewarding because you've got this richness and these conflicts, and also love and friendship that nurture and nourish the story. I've written a lot about absent fathers. I guess one doesn't like to psychoanalyze oneself, but I think for any kid, maybe especially for boys, the relationship between a father and son is pretty crucial. And just that moment of realizing, one's parents aren't infallible. They're indeed very fallible, very human, very flawed. It's a bit of a shock. It was a shock for me, and I feel like I touched on that in Half Brother. Certainly, Ethan in Inkling does a lot of parenting, for his younger sister, because the father is, he's sort of he's not present. My characters do a lot of searching in general. In the case of a ghost story, it started really as I said, a basket of fun ingredients. I don't tend to be super reflective about what my book might mean when I start. I try and avoid that. And I only really understand what the book might be about or what topics it might address as I rewrite and think about it. But when you have someone who gives a ghost tour, you start to think, well, why is this character, why is Gabe, in my story? It's all deliberate. He didn't just fall in. He should be here for a reason. And so it became quite natural for him to have suffered a bereavement. And that could be addressed in the book. So little by little, as you write your story, you begin to become more intentional about, why your characters are here. There's so much artifice in a book. It's all artifice, really. It's very deliberate. It's about choices you make as a writer. So your characters should be in that story for a reason.
But it's interesting you use the word ingredient, because the one thing that links Gabe with his father is their love of food. And there is some absolutely wonderful food writing, which again, you know, if you think back to like Enid Blyton and, oh, I remember
J.K.
reading,
Rowling, even there's a lot of
yeah,
good
yeah,
meals,
yeah,
midnight
yeah,
feast.
picnics and
Yeah.
midnight feasts. And, you know, that just pops up again and again and again. And that link, even though he's extremely angry with his father, you know, he's angry with his father for leaving, and then that rupture becomes permanent. But there's still that it's a very tenuous thread, their love of food and cooking, and it's a way of nurturing their friends. It's his way of nurturing his friends. And I absolutely love that.
I'm glad.
The way you incorporated that into it as well.
My agent, when I sent him early chapters to read in a first draft, he said, it's too much food. You have to get rid of the food. It's so distracting. And I thought, you don't like food. He doesn't, you know, he's just like, you know, I don't think food is maybe a big part of your life or a pleasure. And it's like, I've come to appreciate food more. My son is extremely foodie. So I was, you know, basing Gabe partly on my son, who seemed to be always putting together some amazing, you know, panini or, you know, or pasta dish or something. And he got such pleasure out of it. And I really enjoyed seeing that aspect of him. And it's not, I mean, I've had some good meals in my books, but I think Ghostlight had the most sort of food forward.
I mean, I've read many of your books, but I don't remember ever reading one with this much.
No.
Good. And you know, I think your agent, I agree with you. Your agent possibly doesn't enjoy food, but I love that. I love that connection and the way the only positive memories really Gabe has with his father, you know, for much of the novel is where they go to eat as a family.
Right.
You know, and that whole connection, and his father kind of lives through him, you know, with that shared love of food. So I thought that was just brilliantly done as well. The friendship between Gabe, Rebecca, Kelly, and Yuri, for me, really was the novel's heart. You know, there's a lot of, you know, adventure and excitement and danger going on. But for me, they're the novel's heart. They all have different strengths and abilities, and they face different challenges. We find out about those through the course of the novel. But there's so much humor conveyed in the dialogue between those characters. So, and I find that in many of your novels, that the humor comes through. You know, you are dealing with some dark subjects often, but there's so much humor that is conveyed through the dialogue. Does that come naturally, do you find, from the characters themselves as they develop, or do you have to kind of push it a bit?
Both. I find it sort of presents itself. Often I feel like I've only gotten a handle on a character when they've, you know, I'm writing for the first draft and they say something or they react to something that I think is quite funny. And when someone tells a joke, it's an amazing thing, or says something funny, because you automatically feel endeared to them. You know, you feel this sort of special connection, because laughing is such a wonderful thing. And it really helps me as a writer visualize that character more clearly. But in general, I think contrast is everything in drama. And because human experience on a day by day, hour by hour basis, year by year, includes so many different, you know, colors on the palette of human experience. So it seems crazy to me, you know, some books, you know, are very, I would say, have sort of a monotone in terms of their, you know, their writing or their approach, especially if it's a fantasy or science fiction or sword and sorcery. You know, humor often seems to be seen as sort of slightly jarring or out of place. But I think, you know, we've always needed to, you know, change the moon, temper the darkness with humor, and it makes the darkness darker too. you know, because we have something to compare it to, you know, or else you lose your sense of balance. So I think books, any story, I think benefits from, you know, incorporating humor if your characters are that way inclined. So I've always tried to, you know, to include that in my books.
I think it is a very underrated ability, though. I think it's
Well, it's very personal too. I mean, everyone's sense of
yeah,
humor is most people understand peril or heartbreak much more
yeah,
universally than humor, which is very personal. So it's also, you know, kind of risky because, you know, my sense of humor may not be your sense of humor.
no.
And so you're opening yourself up to people thinking like, I didn't get that person. I just thought they were I thought they were a weirdo or something.
Yeah. But I do think the dialogue is just, it flows so naturally. And you know, Yuri is just such a brilliant part of that whole friendship dynamic as well. I love the way he interacts with the other three characters. And it's just, I just, yeah, I've read the book twice, and it just seemed to me that you're juggling so many balls, but you do it so effortlessly. And I'm
Well, as a writer,
always,
you get to do it in slow motion, you know.
yeah, I suppose.
Every draft is one ball in the air, and then you sort of write
Yeah,
that draft, and then you go back and you throw another ball up. You know, because I couldn't juggle for the life of me. But if it's like you slow
yeah,
it down, I might be able to handle three balls
yeah.
in the air.
I think that's a really good analogy. But it's you know, by the time the reader
Gets to it.
picks up that book,
Yeah.
you know, it's just been honed to perfection. And you know, it's just, you know, it's not it's not your shortest novel by a long
Yeah.
stretch, but
I liked it
it's,
when you said hone to perfection. I liked that because my
oh,
editor
okay,
is here. So Bella, hone to perfection.
honed to
It
perfection. Yeah,
was
take notes,
honed to
Bella.
perfection. Not a single word was unnecessary. Ha,
No, I
I
don't.
wish. I wish.
I absolutely don't think there is an unnecessary word. I mean, there's nothing that you know, it's just so satisfying when you read a novel and you think it all works as a unified whole, and there's nothing you think, no, I wish you'd left that out, or I wish there'd been more of this, you know, and you
Well, thank
don't
you.
come away feeling that at all. I do want to ask you, though, about Viker, Ghostlight's villain, who is just the most amazing fictional villain. I think one of the best I've ever read. He's got a very, very bloody backstory. At one point, he's described as being insatiable in battle, and he is quite horrific. Is he based on a particular historical figure? I mean, there would have been a lot of mercenaries around at
Yeah.
that period in history. I wonder if you read about somebody that you modeled him on, or did he kind of explode full blown as a you know, a proper character?
Well, I mean, my first drafts, the characters tend to be at their least well formed, you know, to the level of, you know, hand puppets that I'm just sort of directing to get me through an early
Yeah,
draft of the story, and a villain especially. But yeah, villains are way more interesting if they, like all your characters, you know, had a backstory, their own goals and desires, and you know, or agenda. And Viker is awful. I imagined him, you know, he was a soldier of fortune, essentially,
mm-hmm.
A mercenary, as you said. I like the idea of him just sort of showing up at key moments of British and American and Canadian history,
Yes,
and having a far larger role than most children are ever or should be taught in school,
yeah,
because I'm having fun with the history. But where I can sympathize with them, I suppose, sympathize might be too empathetic a word, is the idea of a life curtailed or cut short, you know, this intense bewilderment and outrage at being stopped
Yes.
His appetites are very bloody, but I think, most people would feel the same frustration or outrage. They're not going to go quietly into that good night.
No.
And the idea of being a ghost and especially if you were a vigorous person who made things happen, I mean, in his case, terrible things, and then having no power, I think would be very, very just maddening. And, he takes that to a terrible extreme, and it figures out the one way in which he can have more agency and power.
Yeah. I mean, he says at one point that his dream has been denied. And that's really, that is what, is the source of all this rage and this feeling of impotence and, just having to devour and control and,
I think I tried to do a bit of an Iago from Othello with him. The soldier who's always, he's good, but he's passed over. Passed over.
Yeah,
And,
exactly.
He never got to be the commander. He was always a hired hand. So, that was part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I did go and Google the paintings you referred to. I was there.
The paintings are very real.
and I was, yes, I know they are. I was there, I spent ages looking at them, and I thought,
trying to find Viker.
yeah, not on the first reading, but on the second reading, I thought, I'm going to go and look at these because I had a vague recollection of what they looked like, but I wanted to go back and have a look at them in more detail. And I love little, I don't know, little challenges like that, I suppose, that you often get so much pleasure from when you're rereading. The first time I was just like totally immersed, and then I went back and I was rereading it with the same enjoyment, but thinking, right, I need to go and have a look at this. So I was taking breaks rather than go reading at a breakneck speed, because it is one of those books that you just you're on tenterhooks, I think, for an awful lot of the time. So
I do like sending my readers back to fact check, because I think it's one of those fun things that you can do. I did it in the Boundless as well. I use historical figures, but I think you sort of hook kids into the love of history by suggesting these things. And I think they might think, is that true? So I like the idea they might look at, the crossing of the Delaware or the death of General Wolfe. And, it brings history alive in a much more vivid way for them. So I hope it has the effect, not that I'm getting all pedagogical on everyone. I like books to be, fun. But it does have a little added effect.
I did go and have a look, and I also got out my very old battered map of Toronto and had a look at the islands, and then I went further up the St. Lawrence River and had a look at the Thousand Islands, further upstream. So I mean, that's just me. That's something I really enjoy doing, but I think children do as well, but adults will definitely want to go back and reread and have a look at those elements. You explore themes of loyalty and friendship, as we've already talked about. The character of Rebecca Strand is so well drawn, and she does face a dilemma towards the end of the novel when she has her own taste of power. And she actually says to Gabe, savagery will only be defeated by savagery. Did you ever consider having her defect to the dark side? As the first time I read the novel, I was thinking, no, please don't. Just, just don't go there. Please don't. But you kind of, you just don't know what she's going to do at that point.
I like that. I like that it was a tension in you, and that I think that was my purpose. I wanted to make my reader a bit uneasy and just plant that seed in their heads that she has a lot of reason to be angry and frustrated, and it's conceivable she might, resort to savage methods. But in my mind, I never imagined her going over. I wasn't going to do the full Darth Vader on her. I liked her too much. I didn't want her to become a villain. That would have been a very interesting story, but just not the one that I had.
No. And but I think it's certainly ratcheted up the tension there, where she's, in full throttle, and you're just willing her to rein it back in, and remember the friendships that she's built, and do we have a time for you to do a reading? Because I did say I'd really love it if you
really
just a little bit.
I could. Are you sure do we have time? I worry reading is kind of dull on a screen, but I'm happy I can do a short one.
Just choose something that you're happy with, and then we can wrap it up, I think, and go to questions.
Well,
I absolutely love listening to authors read their work. So
really, okay, all right.
I do.
Here's one I don't read when I've been talking to kids a lot, and it is a bit dark, but I always like the little scene that happens near the beginning. Gabe has met Rebecca for the first time, and this is what happens one night on the Toronto island. Across the harbor, the island slept too. In the amusement park, the concession stands were shuttered, the swan boats bobbed against the dock, the Ferris wheel creaked a little in the light wind. On Algonquin and Ward's Islands, the windows of the cozy houses and cottages were dark. The beaches were empty. The doused embers of a bonfire clicked and steamed. The teens who'd lit it had long ago headed home with their damp towels and empty bottles. Over the water carried the haunting call of a loon. 100 meters from shore, on the lake's bottom, among the groves of weed rock and the remnants of wrecked ships, Nicholas Viker slumbered fitfully, one eye open. Overhead through the rippled surface, he saw the full moon. He'd languished down here for so long, it was hard to know how many years had passed. He was such a tiny thing now. After being massacred by the Ghostlight long ago, he'd scuttled into the lake like some pathetic crab, and that had proved a most terrible mistake. The lake had once been a rich source of food. The dead would flutter down from wrecked ships or furtive burials, and he'd feed upon their bewildered ghosts. But those times were long gone. And now he was too weak to come ashore to new hunting grounds. He was fixed like a barnacle, waiting for something to come within reach. It took all his strength just to keep his single eye open. And right now he had that eye fixed on something very interesting. For many years, in the warmer months, a man had come here to swim, all hours, day or night, and he would pass directly overhead before returning to shore. Here he came, now. He was quite old by this time, and Viker could hear his heartbeat through the water, the thing he envied most of all, that thing he would never have again, blood pulsing through his veins. But listen, the man's heartbeat, once so steady, had a warble to it. If Viker could have moved, if he had been stronger, like in the old days, he might have reached a long arm up and touched the man's chest and stopped his stuttering heart altogether. But on this night, the man's heart stopped all on its own. With terrible appetite, Viker watched as the man began to sink. Closer to the bottom, the man's ghost slipped free of his body and saw Viker. "Good evening," said Viker. "It's a lovely night for a swim." "Why are you down here?" asked the man's confused ghost. "The same reason you are, my friend." "I should be getting back," said the man. "I have another length to do." "Dear me," said Viker. "It seems you're having a touch of trouble." "Yes," said the ghost dolefully. I'm just a bit tired." "Well, come closer and I can help," said Viker. "That's awfully kind of you," said the ghost. I don't know what's wrong with me. "Just a little closer," Viker encouraged him. "That's it." Using the last of his strength, Viker closed his hand around the ghost's neck. "Could you let go, please?" the man asked politely. "That's a bit tight." In reply, Viker opened his mouth awfully wide and devoured the ghost head first. Down he went, now lively as a snared eel. But Viker shut his mouth and clamped hard. He felt all the man's thrashing fear pass into him, and with it, his vital energy. That was better, so much better. Slowly, he turned himself toward the shore and began a feeble crab-like shuffle. With luck, he'd have enough energy to make it to land. And there, he could find more ghosts to feed upon. He would make himself strong again. And then he would make things happen. That's how Viker gets introduced into the story.
That's brilliant. Thank you for that. I was hoping you'd read something along those lines.
Oh, really? Okay. Well,
yes, good. Yes, yeah. Which leads me quite nicely into a very short final question. The last sentence of Ghostlight is just like absolutely perfect. And it will make readers like me wonder, is there more in store for this new generation of keepers? Yes,
well,
no, maybe.
Of course there is in your imagination, and I hope the
Yep.
imaginations of my readers. I always liked books that had some open doors because it sort of keeps the story eternal, or at least a little, gives it a little more longevity in their minds. I'm working on a different book for young readers, but I never say never. I mean, I'd love to team these kids back up again and take them to maybe a different lighthouse and some interesting location. I mean, there's a lot of Wakeful and Wicked Dead out there, you know, Alison.
Yeah.
So, you know,
yeah,
there is work to be done. I'm not sure I'm going to tackle it, but maybe.
No. But I do love that you've left the door open, and as you've said, you know, it's for the reader to imagine what happens next for those characters. So thank you so much. Ghostlight, just absolutely stunning. We got a copy of it at my college library today, and one of the students picked it up and said, "Oh, what's this about?" And I did quote you from Twitter and said, "It's a really good Halloween book." So he was
fair enough.
He was, yeah. So he was quite pleased with that. But thank you so much. And I think I hope we've got some questions in the chat. Sure. And I'll let Jen, how are we doing?
Yeah, we do. We have a few questions. The first one we have is from Rachel. She says she absolutely loved Ghostlight. She really loved the friendship group, the romance of lighthouses, and Yuri's story really spoke to her own family experience as well, which is really nice to hear. But she's asking, we've talked about other inspirations, but what's your comfort book that you find yourself returning to?
I have a couple. One would be Roald Dahl's Danny, Champion of the World, which I find, you know, his most atypical book for young readers. It's also his biggest hearted. I just love the father-son story in the caravan in the countryside and their adventures. And I also like Emily of New Moon by Ella Montgomery. Everyone's all very excited about Anne with an E, Anne of Green Gables, but I always preferred Emily of New Moon because she wanted to be a writer. And so that was the first time I had encountered someone in fiction who shared my aspiration. So I found those books absolutely thrilling. So I think I read both of them again during one of the first lockdowns during the pandemic, because comfort reads.
We have another question about your inspirational reads from Anthony. He's asking about Stephen King, you spoke about earlier. Have his stories inspired your writing? And if yes, what's your favorite of his books?
Oh, I feel guilty now because I did throw out Stephen King's name just because he was such a staple of, you know, teen reading when I was in high school. I have not read an entire Stephen King novel. I've read some short stories. My knowledge of Stephen King comes entirely from the movies. I'm so ashamed. But I mean, The Shining, to me, I know The Shining movie is very controversial for Stephen King diehard fans who think the book is really the uber text. But the movie to me is a masterpiece. So I feel like I've seen so many Stephen King movies and adaptations. So I'm being lazy and just, you know, citing him really without, you know, any grounds.
Okay, we have one from Isabel, going back to Ghostlight. Is there a particular aspect of Ghostlight or a particular scene that you especially love or are pleased at how it turned out?
I think I like the scene where Gabe's just had sort of a paranormal encounter in the lighthouse, and he goes home to his apartment, and he lets the budgie out, Charlie. And Charlie's always been talkative, but on this night he's a little more talkative than usual. And it turns out the ghost has sort of been trying to speak through the budgie, and then finds other means of trying to get Gabe's attention. I like that scene. I liked how it progressed because it was creepy, but I also found it humorous as well. So again, there's that mix, and it's a nice sort of balancing act of tones.
Tanya I've got a really interesting question. What's the most fascinating fact about lighthouses that you uncovered during your research?
Well, this one is quite personal. I discovered shortly after finishing the book that I am the descendant of a lighthouse keeper. And it turns out my great-great-grandfather, whose name, by the way, was Uriah Young, who lived off the coast of Nova Scotia, east coast of Canada, on a little craggy island called Ironbound. I always knew my mother's relatives had spent, like 250 years in that part of Canada. They've been in Canada a long time, and that they were fishermen, and that was their livelihood for centuries. It never occurred to me that they were also lighthouse keepers. There was a lighthouse on the island, and Uriah was keeper for like 30 or 40 years. So I have a picture now on my bulletin board of Uriah, my great-great-grandfather, on the steps of his lighthouse, looking for all intents and purposes like a character from a horror film. He's sort of a black hat, black suit, and he's looking right at the camera. But it's a great shot. So it was weird because I've always been fascinated by lighthouses, and I've lived, on both coasts of Canada and offshore on Newfoundland, and I lived in Ireland for a year and in Oxford for 4 years. So I like watery places. I like coastal places. And so when I found out I was related to lighthouse keepers, I was delighted, but weirdly unsurprised. It seemed like not entirely inappropriate. So that was that's my unexpected answer about lighthouses.
That must have felt like a sign, like you were meant to write this book.
I know. It was great. I'm so happy. I feel like, yes, I'm practically an authority,
We have a question from Sarah. Do you have any stories that have been with you for a long time that you haven't written yet but are waiting to come out?
Well, I'm not that far along on anything that's, that I've been working on a long time. I have a few story ideas that keep pulling me back. I have my ideas notebooks, and some ideas, gestate relatively quickly and become books, and others, it takes 10 years. The Nest was a book that I'd been, taking notes on for 10 years before I could write it. And most seem to sort of, hang around for like 3 or 4 years in my ideas notebooks. So I've got one that I'm working on now that I've been kicking around for, I don't know, not too long, maybe 4 or 5 years. But it's good. I think the waiting is good because if I keep getting pulled back to an idea, I really do think it means it has a certain energy or appeal to me anyway that will help me write the book. And I hope that makes it a good story. So I don't mind that sort of, simmering period that goes on in the notebooks.
I think we've got one last one to finish off, and that's from Bella. It sounds a bit like she's checking up on you here. She's asking, can you tell us what you're writing now?
Oh, I'm not telling you, Bella. It's good though. I promise you that it'll be, I'm quite excited about it. It's and I honestly I don't want to be coy or anything. It's just like I've just started writing it, and I've been thinking about it for years, but it's I think it'll be a nice one. a kind of an unusual thriller, I think. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say.
That sounds intriguing. Well, Kenneth, we wish you the best of luck with the Ghostlight. It really is a great book. If you haven't read it, I hope you've been inspired to read it by tonight's conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, everyone who's asked questions, and thank you to Alison for such a really fascinating conversation. Thanks as well to Liz and Bella and all at Guppy Books who have helped put this together. To Jake for technical support. And finally, one big thank you and a little round of applause for Kenneth.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you all for organizing. It was a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you. And yeah, stay well, everyone.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.